Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Today, we're doing a book club episode with Andrew Whitehead, and he wrote a book called American Idolatry: How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church. It is published by Brazos Press. And so if you guys go to our show notes and click that link to Brazos Press, it'll take you right to this book. You can also check out our website, guiltgracepod.com, and you can find this book and this episode as well as YouTube, podcast catcher. So it's pretty easy to find the publishers and the books that we are interviewing on. So you'll also find out a little bit more information about our show, if you're new to us, and how to connect with us and what we're all about, with what it means to bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology, and what these book club episodes are. We're kind of a two podcast in one. We have Doctrinal Monday episodes, and then we also have book clubs that come out as well. And so also just information, if you need to find a church to call home, we have some resources there, a local church finder. There's also just information about our sponsors. We call them bridge builders, Logos Bible Software being our main one. And if there's nothing else that I've forgot, I will let Peter further introduce our guest today, Andrew Whitehead.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce to our audience Dr. Andrew L. Whitehead, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, where he co-directs the Association of Religion Data Archives at the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. He's the co-author of Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the U.S., which won the 2021 Distinguished Book Award from the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. Whitehead has written for the Washington Post, NBC News, Time, and Religion News Service, and speaks frequently about Christian nationalism. So I'm assuming our listeners can probably figure out what we're going to be talking today about Christian nationalism. So my pleasure to introduce you to the show, Dr. Whitehead.
Hey, I'm really glad to be with you guys. And real quick, if it's okay, Nick, as you were talking about resources for your listeners, like to find a church home and stuff, is it cool if I share a really cool resource with the Association of Religion Data Archives?
Yep.
So the ARDA.com, so it's ARDA.com, the ARDA, so the ARDA.com. They can go there, and we have a community profile builder. It's on like the very front page of the website. So nice. You can put in your zip code there and hit and like build a radius around wherever you live or any like part of the country you want to focus on. And it'll pull like census data, and it'll show all of the religious congregations in that area. We use this a lot. Like a lot of what we do is working with clergy and religious leaders. So like they can go, and for a lot of congregations, as you guys probably know, are like smaller. They can't afford, these big companies that build this stuff. So you can go there and build this radius, and it'll tell you like for wherever you want to look, like as small as a quarter of a mile up to 20 miles, like gender, age, income, housing status, like all this census data. It'll pull it in a couple seconds. And then too, it'll show you the religious background and like the religious buildup of your area. So like all the congregations, everything. So it's a really awesome resource that, again, we're trying to really, give to people, show to people, because it's free and they can really understand. So like we've had congregations that are like, should we, what type of ministry should we start? They go there and they find out we have a lot of young people, or we don't really have any young people, but we have a lot of older folks. So like they might have had one idea about their community, but then they find this data and they see, oh, there's something else going on. Racial and ethnic groups, right? All this stuff is right there. So anyways, just wanted to plug that. When I heard, Nick, you say that, I thought, man, I need to share.
That's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We'll also put that in the show notes too for this episode.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sorry, a little bit of an aside, but yeah, that's stuff that I work on.
That's great. I know you work in this. My icebreaker question.
All right.
I don't know if you've ever been asked this before, but I have to ask because I've read this guy before.
Okay.
Do you know of, and I mean, this might be just a shot in the dark. Are you related in any way to Colson Whitehead?
I am not, but I have read, I think 3 or 4 of his books.
Okay.
And Yeah.
Everybody knows Colson Whitehead is black and you're white. So I was like, maybe there's relation, maybe there's not. I don't know.
I wish I was connected in some way to him. He's a brilliant writer, and his books are amazing. Have either of you read any of his work?
I have started Underground Railroad, but the other ones in the Crook Manifesto, his new one that's coming out is on my wish list.
Okay. So Underground Railroad, and then the Nickel Boys was another one that was really.
He's a 2-time Pulitzer author. When he's written like 4 books, I was like, how in the world do you write Pulitzers on your first few tries?
Yeah. No, he's really good. For
those who don't know who Colson is, he's a very well-known fiction writer.
Yeah.
Mostly around race, but he's a fantastic writer.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Underground Railroad is really moving, and then the Nickel Boys too was one that was really moving. So no, sadly, not connected to him. Wish I could meet him in some way.
But you got the same last name, so there's something there. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Alfred North Whitehead, which I'm not a philosopher, but I think he's a famous philosopher. So
yeah.
That's what I'll hear too. Like, hey, you connected to him or related? And I was like, I don't know, maybe, but not that I know.
That's true. Yeah. I read a lot of fiction. So the first name that came to my mind was Colson. So I figured to kind of throw that up there.
Yep. No, it's good. Sorry. No, not connected. Can't get you the autographed copy you might want.
Darn it. Yeah. Shoot. So first real question. So beyond your bio and kind of your academic stuff, let our listeners know a little bit more about Andrew Whitehead.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I mean, again, I'm just really excited to be with you all, and so grateful you connected with the book and engaged with it. And hopefully too, your listeners will. So for me, I just see book writing like anything is a part of the journey, right? And so for me, a little bit more about myself. I am married, and we celebrated 18 years this past May. We have 3 kids, our 2 boys and a girl. Oldest and youngest are boys. And actually a big part of my story and kind of my faith journey too, is our boys, our oldest and youngest, have pretty profound intellectual disabilities.
Oh, okay.
And so that has really reshaped like how I view the gospel and faith and congregational work, and just all those things, kind of the things we've had to walk through with them, has really shaped me, and it connects too to some of what I write about in this book. That if I'm not at work writing and doing work stuff, or not watching kids, I enjoy exercise, so swimming, biking, running.
You're a triathlete.
I do a little bit. I enjoy those, and I think it helps kind of burn off, the stress that builds up from work.
Both Nick and I do CrossFit, but we have great appreciation for triathletes.
Yeah. My wife did CrossFit for a while. She hasn't gotten into a group since we've moved, but I went to one workout and it was like, I survived, but man,
that's like me and running. It's like I did it, but I didn't do it well.
Yeah, it was incredible. Yeah. Okay, and then the last thing, recently took up drinking coffee. I don't know if you guys are coffee guys. Yeah.
Oh,
I just started like in my 40s, which is kind of late.
I've got my cold brew right here.
There you go. And so it's such an efficient caffeine delivery system. I was like, I got to get into it. But the nitro cold brews I've just started, and those are like great. So I'm obsessed with those right now. But so that's a little bit about me.
And I learned this recently too, about cold brews are way healthier for you.
Are they?
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because
healthier than what?
So my wife does some, she just looks into like being healthy and all that stuff. And so for a while we've had just, you brew your own coffee with a pot, and it's got, and there's, there's something about boiling or having hot water mixed with plastic containers that just doesn't seem common sense, right? And for just cold brew, the way it's filtered or created, I think even internally in your body is better for you.
Oh yeah, there's gonna be like minerals and all that stuff that probably shouldn't be in your body that get into it.
Yeah. And we don't have that crash that we had with just a hot brewed pot of coffee at home. Like cold brew keeps me a little bit more steady and alert throughout the day. So
Okay.
maybe it's anecdotal, maybe it's just me, but I don't know. I do enjoy my hot coffees too every now and then. So
I'm all about, I used to be a coffee snob. big time coffee snob, but
Okay.
now I literally buy Folgers instant from Costco.
Oh,
And then
no.
I have my kettle right over there and I just brew that. So I know,
I don't
that
know if I
doesn't,
can. I might have to hop
Blasphemy.
off. I don't know if I can do this.
Yeah.
trust me, I know I'm like I don't know, like a pariah in the reform world because they're all
Yeah.
about their brews and all that stuff. It's like I drink instant. And then I get looks like that. It's like, are you human? It's yes, I'm
Yeah.
I'm still a regular
I think
person.
that too.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah. So about this book, and we're gonna
Yes.
begin a general question.
Yeah.
And you've talked about this a little bit. What's the background for this book, and then second, and attached to it, how did your own experience and your scholarly research lead to writing American Idolatry?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and I share some of this too at kind of the outset of the book, as you guys know, because the book really is a result of my personal faith journey of being a Christian for decades, but then also my academic professional journey, right, as a scholar. So I grew up in a really rural, small town in northern Indiana. So like 1,600 people. Like it's been between 1,000 and 2,000 people for like 80 years, right? It's just this tiny place.
Yeah,
A cornfield behind my house.
it's like a neighborhood in
And
Santa Ana is 1,000 people.
yeah, no, I bet. Yeah, like one subdivision is bigger than this town. And you know, it was a great place to grow up because it's like kids ride their bikes anywhere. You know, we attended church. I attended church all growing up, and you know, it was a very formative part of who I am, right? And I look back on it and I recognize like much of what I learned both in those congregations, but then in the community itself was this idea of like neighborliness and love and how to, you know, support people and how to love Jesus, you know, and loving the Bible, like all of these things. I grew up within white evangelicalism in a place where, you know, this idea of the US as a Christian nation was kind of taken for granted. Like to be a good Christian is to be American, and to be American, you know, is kind of to be Christian. And, you know, we need to advocate for certain, you know, issues in the public square, and that's part of being a good Christian. And so all these things were a part of, you know, what it was to be, you know, an American and Christian for me. And so, you know, all of that was kind of the water that I swam in. But you know, as I grew older, then I think there were times where in my personal faith journey there were things that started to show or to bring up kind of, I think, at least to me, I think inconsistencies where I was like, okay, loving your neighbor or you know, being a Christian, following Jesus's commands started to, in some ways, I thought, butt up against or differ, you know, from, you know, what might be expected of us as Americans, or even, you know, conservative Americans, let's say, like politically or whatever else. Or if we looked back at American history, right, like thinking about, well, if this was a Christian nation, starting to wonder why, you know, how do we square that with, you know, pushing Native Americans off their lands and the Trail of Tears and, you know, some of the genocide that was committed.
Slavery for 100
Yes.
plus years. Yeah.
Yeah. Slavery, where we enslaved folks. And, you know, the Declaration, all men are created equal, but really meant, you know, landowning European white men, right? Not women, not Black Americans, all of those things. So that started to happen. And so I had to kind of wrestle with like this faith that I loved, and what I was taught, with then some of the cultural aspects of it. And so then as I went to grad school, you know, started to learn my craft of sociology and to look at, you know, basically sociology is the study of human interaction and the consequences of those interactions, right? So like as we get together and we interact, we create things that are greater than just the individual parts, right? So we create organizations, institutions, we create countries. And so being able to study that, and then think about my faith and how those things intersect. And then I read Greg Boyd, his book, Myth of a Christian Nation. And at that point in my life, like some of the questions and the journey I was on, and then what I was learning and kind of being able to study why Americans do what they do and believe what they believe, it kind of fell into place, right? Where I started to see, you know, the kingdom of God as something separate from kingdoms of this world. And, the United States as a country is necessarily a kingdom of this world. And so once I saw that, it's like, okay, well then what gets slotted into each, and how do I make sense of this? And so my personal faith journey was taking me there. And then, really quickly with my professional journey, learning the skills of studying large surveys of the American public, we started to see these questions that we were asking around, if people believed the US was a Christian nation and that the government should advocate Christian values or declare it a Christian nation, folks that, really strongly agreed with those things, what those beliefs were associated with, we found, it predicted a lot of attitudes above and beyond whether they were individually religious, personally religious, above and beyond political party or their political ideology. So it was a really influential measure of kind of how people felt a particular expression of Christianity should be privileged in the public sphere. And then that's going to affect how they see the world. So as I was on this personal journey, this professional journey is taking place as well. And then it kind of both comes together in this book where I'm kind of sharing, what I found professionally and in academia and in the research, I think undergirds kind of what I think too, as a Christian, I've come to see with Christian nationalism as ultimately, making Americans less Christ-like. If we want to move towards Christ-like love for our neighbors in the world, I think it hinders us in some ways from doing that. So
Gotcha.
that's,
cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Got it. So thanks for that background. That helps understand where you're coming from on that. And going into, we always like to define, have words, topics defined up front, just to smooth things out on the front end. So
it's too easy to have like personal definitions of this versus like, oh, what was yours and what was mine?
Totally.
Yeah. And it might create a follow-up question for clarification too, but we'll just start with a simple question. Can you please help define Christian nationalism?
Yeah. No, that's super important, right? So defining terms, we have to start there. And so the definition of Christian nationalism that I offer in the book, and that I use is where it comes from. It's the result of really dozens of peer-reviewed studies, and then the book that we wrote and other research that other scholars are doing as well, political scientists, which means that this definition is empirically supported, right? So there's data behind what we're saying Christian nationalism is. So I'm not just like kind of making it up out of thin air, right? So that's really important because, as you said, we're in a moment where folks are like, well, that is Christian nationalism, and this is, and it's all this different stuff.
Yeah.
But this is, built on and based on work that we've done. So Christian nationalism, I define as a cultural framework, and cultural frameworks can be a lot of different things, but basically they include narratives and value systems and symbols that humans put together to make sense of their social worlds, right? And they're useful because they help us interact and understand who we are as a group, where we're going, how to get there, all of those things. But this particular cultural framework of Christian nationalism, it idealizes and advocates for the fusion of a particular expression of Christianity. And I want to be really like laser focused on that, right? There are many different expressions of Christianity, and it wants this particular expression to be fused with and privileged with American civic life. And it believes that this version of Christianity should be the principal and undisputed cultural framework in the US, and that the government should take steps to preserve that cultural framework, right? So beyond any theological or religious beliefs associated with Christianity, which again, there are different expressions of Christianity, and many of them hold those exact same theological beliefs, right? In common, whether you're Reformed or you're Anabaptist or Pentecostal. But this particular expression of Christianity within Christian nationalism really is tends to be more of a politically and religiously conservative, ethnocentric orientation of Christianity. And there's a number of different elements that, again, we find in the research that make up this cultural framework. So it's this, the theological aspects of Christianity, but then it adds on this cultural baggage. And so here are some of those elements, just really quick. So one we find is a very strong sense of moral traditionalism based on creating and sustaining social hierarchies. So in society, there are people at the top, in the middle, and at the bottom. And usually these revolve around gender and sexuality, like who essentially has access to all aspects of the society, social system. The next one is a comfort with authoritarian rule. So it sees the world as a chaotic place where sometimes we need strong rules to enforce that hierarchy and strong rulers to come in and basically ensure that we follow that hierarchy, right? So we need folks to come in and take control, demand order, those types of things. The third element we find over and over is a strong association with a desire for strict boundaries around national identity. So who gets to call themselves an American? Who is seen as truly American? And oftentimes we find that this falls along ethno-racial lines. So when we're talking about Christian nationalism, it really is thinking that the ideal American, and it isn't something that people would explicitly say usually, some do, but for many, it's implicitly understood that it's white, natural born citizens. Like that is the true American. And again, these are implicit things. So like we, in our questions that measure Christian nationalism, we don't mention race anywhere, right? It's just about, do you think Christianity, the government should advocate for Christian values and things like that. But when Americans hear that, especially white Americans hear that, there's a racialized aspect in there. So when we look at their attitudes towards race, those things tend to go together. And then the final element is a populist kind of impulse where, we find with Christian nationalism, it kind of inclines Americans towards feelings of persecution, victimization, conspiratorial thinking and suspicion towards elites, whether it's academics like me, or politicians, or scientists, universities, those types of things. So those are elements that we see in the literature that kind of are a part of this cultural framework. So again, the short version is Christian nationalism. It's a cultural framework that desires a particular expression of Christianity to be privileged in the public sphere.
Gotcha. And I think attached to this, and Nick will have a follow-up question, and because we've kind of seen maybe a more recent fervor for Christian nationalism, and the assumption is this is kind of a new movement, that it's kind of come from nowhere, and now that we're reacting to culture and where culture's going, now we got to bring all this stuff back in. But you made the case that this is not a new movement. This is not something that's kind of come out of nowhere, just as in reaction to wherever a cultural moment is. So where or how have we seen Christian nationalist sentiment in American history, maybe most prominently?
Yeah, no, it's a really great observation. And I think one that'll resonate, right, with other folks. Like, okay, what is this? Where did it come from? Why am I just now hearing about this? Right. And I think that makes it seem like it is new, right? And what we find too, though, is that it isn't. But some of what we're seeing right now is what media scholars call like an amplification spiral, right? So when something comes out and then others start to think about it, you start to look for it more, and then lo and behold, you find more of it, and so it just kind of builds.
It's like buying a new car, and then all of a sudden you see your car everywhere on the road.
Everywhere. Yeah, totally. And so that, I think, is part of what's going on kind of in this moment. And there are a lot of reasons for why that is. But, in writing our first book, and talking with fellow Christians or people who are secular, but in their communities, they were like, okay, this kind of helped make sense of kind of what I was seeing and put some of those puzzle pieces in place, right? So like, okay, now I can kind of categorize some of those beliefs and values. That's what this was. And so I think in that sense, that's probably why we see more of it right now, is it's been helpful. But I think a lot of what is happening too is the US has diversified and continues to diversify as a nation, right? So both religiously, demographically, and especially over the last 30 to 40 years, that creates a different context where our different religious beliefs, whether we're Christian, Reformed, or Hindu, or Muslim, or secular, we're all, now operating in a different social system and interacting in ways that are different. So I think for many Christians, it seems the world is shifting around us or them or whoever, and making sense of, okay, this used to be taken for granted, right? That like we're a good Christian nation, and now there are folks that are saying like, hey, can we not say that we're a Christian nation because I'm secular, but I want to be American? And so I think those discussions are happening, and so we see this shifting around folks. But I think too, in the last, we'll just look in 100 years, but it goes back even before the founding of the U.S., where we see this idea of this group that we're a part of coming to these shores, Christian, God is with us, and that's what we're all about. But even the last 100 years, you'll see Christian nationalism pop up in response to fears around social unrest. I think that's when you really see it kind of crop up. So when it seems the ground is shifting around us, like with, religious and ethnic diversity, people will look for these cultural frameworks to help them make sense, right, of the world. Like, okay, what are we all about? Who are we as a people? And Christian nationalism provides a nice checklist of like, okay, we're all about these things. So if we look back even in the early 1900s, Kevin Kruse, who's a historian, wrote a book, One Nation Under God, and he looks at, in fears around the New Deal and fears of creeping socialism, this kind of upswing of Christian nationalism. And then a couple decades later, in the Red Scare in the 1950s, we see folks moving again towards Christian nationalism, wanting to centralize. And again, it's not just like evangelical Protestants, like mainline Protestant denominations are part of that. It isn't just one religious group, but they're all agreeing that like, hey, we need to put under God in our allegiance, right? And that happened in the 1950s, the Pledge of Allegiance. Or we need to put in God we trust on our bills, right? And that happened in the 1950s. But when we put in God we trust on our coins, that happened actually in 1864, which what was happening in 1864?
Civil War.
Civil War. So in these times of social change and unrest, these types of explanations of who we are, what we're all about, those come into play. So I really think our current iteration is part of what was happening in the 1970s with the rise of the Christian right. And that was in response to a time and period of social unrest with the 1960s, the Vietnam War, the gender and sexual revolution, civil rights movement. And so we're kind of, I think, in the lineage of that moment right now. But again, in history, we see this pop up, and it's a powerful cultural framework and story that Americans can latch onto.
Almost like before next question, to maybe ground it for our audience, maybe like you've been part of the same people group, same economic group, same demographic group for whoever knows how long. And then all of a sudden these new people start trickling in. You never had to think about your identity before then? Right. Like, who am I? What am I doing? Because it's just kind of assumed, like, I'm part of this group and this is what everybody does. When new people come in with different values, different systems, then you have to start thinking, okay, how am I different? How am I differentiated? Do I want to be part of this group? Do I want to stay part of my group? I didn't know there were other options outside of this. Right.
Yeah.
So you now actually think about your identity versus before it was just kind of assumed.
Yeah, no, totally. I think so. And I think too, like, it's probably something, I don't know if this is true for you guys, but even as a Christian, like, you grow up as a young person, if you grew up in church, maybe you guys didn't, I don't want to assume, but
yeah, I grew up. I think we both grew up in church. Yeah.
Yeah. So like you go to your church and you're like, okay, this is what it means to be a Christian. And like, that is kind of it. And then you visit your friend's church or you go to college and it's like, well, how do I find a church? And all of a sudden there's different expressions of Christianity. You're like, okay, what is this? It's a similar thing where as we, on our journeys, as we get older, we start to see like, okay, there are different options here. And we have to think through like, well, then, for you all, like, am I Reformed or not, or Anabaptist or not? And then we have to, wrestle with that. It's the same. Yeah, I think you're right on.
Cool.
Yeah, I got a meaty question coming up, and it's not a secret because we talked offline. But before that, real quick,
yeah, Dr. Whitehead's ready for this. Yeah, he's not getting clubbed over the head.
Yeah, talking about the resurgence and why it seems a little more prevalent these days. And I know you don't really address this in the book, but I think it's without saying, like, we know that there is an extreme militant left that is happening. And has happened in the last number of years, and it's fueling the fire for the extreme right, really, too. So I could see how the divisiveness in this country is very unfortunate, and that's why people need to have more conversations too. I mean, there's there's a lot of anger on the. I don't think you're. I'm not putting words in your mouth, so please correct me. But I don't think you're excusing the far left for certain actions, and that's not what this book is about, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. This one is, I mean, there are lots of issues I think that in our society we have to deal with, and only so many books that I can humanly write. So this one is
Yeah.
focused on one, and so that's, yeah, point taken. I think as Christians, we have to engage and think clearly and deeply about a lot of different topics. And yeah, so this one is focused on just this particular issue, which I think right now is a little more, the American Christian church, especially for white Americans, is a little more prevalent, a little more more likely maybe to trip folks up. And so yeah, that's what this book's focused on. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So going into this, putting it out there, it's a really obvious thing, but just for the audience and just for disclaimer, I am also equally opposed to Christian nationalism, and to take an extreme extra definition further, white Christian nationalism, totally bad, anti-gospel. When I've thought about the definition in my own mind of even, I'll just say white Christian nationalism, I think a lot of people would think the same way as me, is that you're thinking of a neo-Nazi skinhead person, which is racist, and they're not representing Christianity, but somehow they're trying to loop Christianity into their arguments of the white race being superior, which is completely just bogus and terrible. We would all oppose that for sure. So going into the book too, so with that said, I disagree with white Christian nationalism. I also agree the United States is not legally a Christian nation, agree with that. I personally am a creedal, confessional, Orthodox Christian. Obviously, I'm white, Caucasian. I believe all people are made in the image of God and we're equal. But I am conservative, and I actually vote almost exclusively Republican, to be just clear. So as I'm reading this book does become political because it's part of the, I agree too. America, nothing other than God should be worshipped. And I think that there is a problem where people elevate the United States to be an idol. And that's just the title of the book, American Idolatry. Nothing should be idolized above God. So, and being an American, and I mean, yeah, we've had our problems in this country for sure. What country hasn't? Until the second coming of Christ, nothing will be perfect. We're far from perfect, but obviously, I do believe in this country, and I'm glad that we're American, and being Republican and being someone that believes in the Second Amendment and all these things, right? And then I'm reading the book, and I have my own definition in my mind of the extreme white Christian nationalism, but it starts to feel like, because of who I am as a Caucasian, conservative, Christian, Republican, am I getting looped in to this definition of what you're saying, Christian nationalism? Because I obviously hope not. And I would disagree. And before you answer, I would actually cordially disagree that I am not a white Christian nationalist, obviously. And I feel like there's a definition, because there's a lot of conservative Christians that would obviously dislike white Christian nationalism. So yeah, I'll let you kind of respond to that.
Yeah, totally. No, I totally get it and understand where you're coming from. And two, I'm grateful as well for the engagement, right? And bringing that into the conversation. So I really appreciate you asking this question. And two, honestly, the fact that there were parts of the book where you're like, okay, this is challenging me. I hope I read books that challenge me in the same way, right? So that's an act of, wanting to truly learn and grow. So I appreciate that and applaud that. So I think one thing that I want to do is kind of disentangle some of what gets so easily packaged together in these types of conversations. So in this book, in our previous book, and in the work that I do, I always want to talk in terms of Christian nationalism, so the ideology, and not in terms of Christian nationalists. So I really don't ever want to, and I don't label folks, even when journalists are like, hey, this politician who claims to be Christian nationalist, I even then won't, I mean, if they claim it, I guess I can say, well, they claimed it, but I don't want to call them a Christian nationalist, because what that tends to do is shut down conversation, right? So I'm not about labeling folks. And when folks see it as a part of their identity, then they feel like my identity is being attacked. And that's really difficult. And I think that creates a lot of the troubles we're in right now. But I do think ideologies and cultural frameworks like Christian nationalism should be interrogated like really strongly. And so if there are aspects of Christian nationalism that your listeners or you all, or even myself, on my journey, accepted, then I do want to talk and think really clearly and maybe in some ways critically about those beliefs. But that isn't necessarily that I'm saying that you are X, right? That you're a Christian nationalist, and so you are, this bad person. But I do think, just like with anything, there are going to be things that we have to, beliefs we hold, that we have to, think critically about, and maybe in some ways, let go of, leave behind. And so I think that's part of my journey with Christian nationalism, that I hope too for listeners or those who read the book will see that as well, that we may be on different parts of this journey, but I'm at a point where I feel like, hey, white American Christians, we should be really critical towards some of these aspects of Christian nationalism. And so that's the first part. I think the second part is when we measure Christian nationalism, we ask a number of different questions usually, and then we, put those together to create a scale. And so again, it isn't that people are like one, one equals Christian nationalist. Yeah, it's not a binary. It is a spectrum. And so folks are all along the spectrum. We find Americans all along this Christian nationalism spectrum. So even again, right there, I don't want to say you're in this group. Now in our work, we'll kind of group people together on that scale to kind of make it easier to talk about. Like if you're at the upper reaches of the scale, we talk about that group. If you're kind of in the middle, you're one of two groups. At the lower end, you're another group. And so I do talk about people and not individual people, but I'll talk about that group, right? So there are some groups that are really, on the upper reaches of the scale. And so then again, we're talking in terms of probabilities, right? So folks at the upper end of this scale, they might be more likely to hold certain beliefs, but it isn't certain. And it certainly isn't certain about an individual, right? But when we look across American adults, those that strongly embrace Christian nationalism, they are more likely to, feel really uncomfortable with interracial marriage, which, or really oppose immigrants and think that they're all criminals. And those are beliefs I think that are anti-Christian, right? And so that's where I want to interrogate this ideology. So I think there are really faithful, well-meaning, loving folks who might embrace Christian nationalism pretty strongly when we look at those questions that we use to measure it. And I hope that when they see what those are associated with, like again, across a broad survey, that they're like, well, maybe I need to rethink, how strongly Christianity should be, privileged in the public sphere, because I disagree, right? I disagree that Black Americans are somehow less than white Americans. Yep. I disagree that immigrants are all criminals. So that's what I hope the book and some of this work does. And so the next part of that, right, is we talk about voting. I think what we see right now in the US, right, it's essentially a two-party system, which leaves a lot to be desired because, it comes down to one or the other. It is a binary.
Yep.
But
you're almost expected to like be one party or another. And if you're not, like, you're kind of not part of anything.
Yeah,
And both
totally.
choices are kind of bad.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and so I think too, for Christians, really interrogating like how much not only hope we put in the political process, but then two, aligning that with what it means to be a good person or a good Christian. Like anybody that says you can't vote for one party or else you're not a Christian, like should be dismissed, right?
Mhm.
Because that is a separate question.
And it's
I get
also an
that.
entirely American question
Yeah.
Right.
when there's a global context to all this stuff that we're just completely
Exactly.
forgetting.
Yeah, totally. And so when we have Christians from other countries that are evangelical come to our shores, they're like, why is this such a big
Yeah,
part of it?
exactly.
Like, and this may, this one of those is gun control, right? And the Second Amendment. Like there's a lot, that's a whole different conversation. But
Sure.
they're like, why is this so strongly held onto by conservative evangelical Christians, where in other countries it's just not? And so again, that highlights the
And they're not calling
cultural
those who hold this bad. They just don't understand why. Like, why are you holding on this? They're not critiquing it. They're like, we just don't hold this.
Yeah, totally. So then we can think about, okay, how does this then align with my faith? So, when we're thinking of then Republican Party platform, I think even being conservative is separate from voting Republican, right? So, are you guys familiar with the website First Things?
I am. Yep.
Yeah. So
we had their editor on, R. Reno, a little while ago.
Yeah. So nobody would read that and think that that is a liberal or leftist website, right? It's conservative,
big time.
Christian, all of that. But there's this great article on there, and I just use this as an example, Nick, as I think about this, where the author Matthew Loftus, the title of the article is "The Conservative Christian Case for Single-Payer Healthcare." Now, if you go to like your local Republican Party group or even on the national stage, and you bring up single-payer healthcare,
that's a big no-no.
Big no-no, right? Like that is not something that the Republican Party, you'll be called all sorts of things, right? Marxist, socialist,
Obamacare, all that stuff.
Anti-Christian, right? All that. But this author, Matthew Loftus, really makes this, really logical and wonderfully laid out case where for me, I don't necessarily identify as politically conservative, but I'm like, that makes sense, right? Like he's saying as we define conservatism, as we define Christian, he said there's like a clear path towards single payer healthcare. So all that to say, we need to hold our identities right with open hands and understand that when we come to data, like examining that data and those arguments, be willing to engage and think about policies that encourage the common good. Because conservatism, one widely held definition, right, is folks who desire to preserve traditional institutions, practices, and values.
Have you ever read Jonathan Haidt on this stuff? His The Righteous Mind?
Yeah, the Righteous Mind stuff.
And you're reminding me of his case in this.
Yeah. So, when we're talking about preservation, I think there are aspects of, at least right now, this current iteration of the Republican Party that really doesn't want to preserve traditional political institutions and values and practices. So I'm saying there need to be, and I hope there are and become more, conservative Christians who are able to make that case. But whether or not that aligns with the Republican Party, I would say in some ways it shouldn't, right? Like, again, with Matthew Loftus, reading his, I'm thinking there maybe some of those don't fall under either political party. And then one or both need to start to realign. And that's where I think Christians, when we embrace Christian nationalism, we lose some of that prophetic voice because we get just put right into this group and you have to vote this way or else you're not a good person or not a good Christian. This isn't, and I'm definitely not advocating for some type of third way where we just opt out of politics. Because again, I think in the book, and maybe we'll talk more about this, I think as Christians, we're called to move to the marginalized and those being crushed and being harmed. And when we do that, that is necessarily a political act, right? Like you're going to be placed on one side or the other. And so for me, I'm at the point in my journey where I'm like, okay, I want to be found with those folks because I'm convinced that's where Jesus placed himself and that's where God is. And again, that's where I come to it in my reading of the story of God interacting with us over time. But, hopefully, Nick, that like helps disengage some of, those identities that get lumped together. I think we can disentangle them and we start to see then where we can take Christianity and disentangle it from Christian nationalism. And I think that's an important part. So again, it isn't just the folks who are, waving, a Confederate flag or a Nazi flag and holding
the Christian
a cross.
nationalist flag or whatever it is.
Yeah. But when those folks feel comfortable enough to hold a cross and those flags, then I think we need to, as Christians, be like, well, why do they feel comfortable doing that? Yeah. And what do we need to do to be like, listen, that doesn't align with the gospel. It doesn't align with the kingdom of God. And I think that's where we've struggled, to be honest. And that's where the book, I hope, helps resource folks that are conservative in different ways to say like, hey, there are things that you can do to support the flourishing of other Americans, which, what's more patriotic than that? We can do it well, right? But it doesn't just mean like what the Republican Party says. Like we can reform this. And yeah, there's other things to say there too. But I hope that kind of gets to what you're talking about.
Yeah, no, that's really fair. I appreciate that. Obviously this book and this conversation is not about me in any way, but it's just helping with the dialogue.
Yeah, totally.
Based on what you're saying, it's unfair to lump, and that's like my main thing going in this. I don't want to be lumped all the way into something one way or another. And even like most important, all three of us are Christian. That's our identity. We're in Christ. So forget about politics altogether. Like we're Christian. That's above being American. That's above being conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat. I would say I don't even really, I just happen to vote Republican most of the time. But I would say to go with what you're saying, there's different levels. I don't just blindly vote Republican because there's an R on the ticket. I just personally am socially conservative. I'm a little bit more open-handed on the financial side, to be really honest, and people can disagree with like what you're saying with the healthcare system. Right. And
but people think you have to be one tribe or the other, and you have to fit into one. Where the left side will say, if you're Christian, therefore you're Christian nationalist. If you're Republican, therefore you're Christian and the Christian nationalist. The right side will say the same thing to the left. And you just like all you have are people putting each other into a single box and saying, if you're this, then you must be this because everybody else is like this.
Yeah. And I think we'd all agree the unfortunate thing right now is the left is always playing the racist card, pointing at conservative people like, you guys are racist, and then the far right is always saying the woke card, and it's just and we're like, okay, well, let's have a conversation. What are you talking about? They both
end up meaning nothing.
Yeah, and so that's my point is just because I can't change my ethnicity. And
those who are watching on YouTube, all three of us are white, so it's not like we're all following this group.
I may. If there's one thing that could change, would be my political views, and obviously, and that's good because like I'm always going to be Christian. I'm saved by Christ. I'm justified. So, that helped flush things out. My fear is, and I don't know if fear is the right word, because you talk a lot about in your book about fear is a big trigger, but my concern would be that if someone misinterpreted your book, they would see somebody like me as, oh, that's a Caucasian Christian guy. I can tell he's conservative. Oh, he's pro guns or something like that. Oh, he must be a white Christian nationalist, and automatically not, and just put me in a box. And if they talk to me, it's like, whoa, that guy is definitely not a white Christian nationalist,
Yeah, no, I think, there's overlap, right? If we're thinking like in terms of a Venn diagram where when we're talking about, for me, Christian nationalism, which is again, this broadly held cultural framework that people can more or less embrace. And there are folks that do. And then when we're talking about, white nationalists, which I think is what you're mentioning, like folks that believe the white race is superior, they may draw on Christian symbolism but really they're talking about like Western civilization. So there's some overlap in those Venn diagrams, but they're definitely not one and the same, right? Like there are folks and most Americans, right, would explicitly say like, there's no way that I think white people are superior to all Black Americans. But I think, though, too, with that, there are folks that embrace Christian nationalism, or at least are sympathetic to it, where if we're talking about, certain, like, this is kind of right in the news with the recent Supreme Court, and we don't have to get into it, but just using it as an example, affirmative action, right? And so different views on what, as a society, we owe to Black Americans. They might see that very differently, right? So it's not as though they necessarily, they would say that they don't hate anybody, but, are they, willing, or how do they view this idea of what we owe to Black Americans? They might view that differently. And so I think that's where then, as Christians thinking about Christian nationalism, I come to different kind of interpretations of what's required of me to, again, align myself with the marginalized, with those that are being, harmed or crushed by social systems that in this country, for, as we say, like for white men, it generally, it's not as though we don't have to work hard to, get what we want, but we don't have the extra hurdles of our skin color, right? And that's what it's talking about, is like, the way that our country was aligned, for hundreds of years. There were significant hurdles that we just didn't have to face, necessarily. So those are all have to get worked out, like, in conversation, right? And we're different points of our journey. So yeah, again, Nick, it's not as though they're one and the same. And folks that would say they're one and the same, I'm not one of those folks. But there are people that will take our research and make that claim, or say that we make that claim, or I make that claim and I don't.
Okay.
But yeah.
So we'll talk, and Nick's already kind of brought this up, and you kind of already brought it up. And there's a few themes, I think, that run through this book, and this book is a few chapters, and we don't have to talk about every single chapter. It would take too long, but I think there's a few themes that kind of run throughout. And one of those, like we've talked about, could be some like cultural reaction to whatever's happening and kind of crops back up again, some Christian nationalists or Christian nationalism. And one of those is a response to cultural changes is the desire for power over this, the desire to kind of dominate over this. Like, hey, we feel dominated, we feel persecuted, therefore we have to kind of come back harder. So power of the political flavor, I think, tends to be the weapon of choice. How has this power been used, and why is its use antithetical to the gospel?
Yeah, definitely. So this, I think, power is kind of the central idol of Christian nationalism, as I write in the book. And, we really have to be precise here too, when we're talking about power. So power is the ability to basically get things done, right? Whether or not other folks want it to happen, you're able to do it, right? So whether they want to go along with you or not, if you have power, you're able to get it done. And so it isn't just broadly power, but I think self-interested power. So it's power to the benefit of one's own group, however that's defined, at the expense of others. I think that's the idol of white Christian nationalism. So when we're talking about politics, that's necessarily about power. And I don't see how you could be an American citizen and or a Christian and not be involved in politics, because it has something to say about how we live together, right? We're to be involved in that. But if we want to look at examples, I think the way that you can understand this is like the civil rights movement. They, were trying to force change on the country, right? And that took power. It took politically, it took power applied politically to make those changes. So it isn't as though power Christians should not use, because again, there were Christians, civil rights leaders. But it's power applied in such a way to the benefit of all. It doesn't just benefit. They weren't saying, now Black Americans should be able to vote and no white Americans should vote. They're saying, hey, everybody should be able to
Martin
vote.
Luther King was pretty explicit about what he wanted to do.
Yeah. And so that is the difference. And that's where we have to kind of make that distinction. But when we're saying that only certain people should vote or have access to the political process, that is power applied just for the benefit of one group. And Christian nationalism, we find in this research, again, that over and over, Americans that embrace it are more likely to want to limit access to the democratic process, especially for minorities. And so I think as a Christian, that's a problem. And so that's where it isn't as though we shouldn't, use power, but again, power applied to help all. So if we're going to join with God, in the renewal of all things, and when Jesus, I kind of talk about this in the book, in Luke, his first sermon, where he comes and he's talking about the work of the kingdom of God and what he's all about. I think that has implications for our collective lives, not just our spiritual lives, but collectively how we live together. And that's where I see Christian nationalism and its pursuit of power just to benefit one group or to privilege one group. I think that is what then betrays the gospel work that we're to be a part of. And so that's kind of how I see it as antithetical.
Yeah. So it's not so much the power per se, but it, like you say, it is the privileging of a specific people, ethnic group, whatever it may be, and the privileging of a certain interpretation of Christian truth and applied to all people. So that like maybe they are kind of all people in a sense, but it's our interpretation is put up on everybody else, and you better like it because that's what we think you need.
Right. Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay. And I think this is a helpful thing to say and have you acknowledge or say it in a better way on your end, because this is your book, this is your work, so this is your intellectual property. So this book is not, obviously it's not anti-Christian, and it's not anti-American or anti-patriotic, right?
Yeah. Not at all. Yeah. I mean, there are going to be folks that say it is, right? So
sure.
Folks that are like,
based off your own
interpretation.
Yeah. If you're like, oh, I hold to this, so therefore he's against me, therefore he's against America. But that's definitely not what you say in the book.
No, not at all. Not at all. Yeah.
Because some people might see the label Christian nationalism and see us push back with what Christian nationalism is and say, oh, are they against Christianity? Are they against being American? And you would say, no, I am Christian and you are American. And you say in part of the book, can you be patriotic with these viewpoints? So I wanted to underline that. And also the fact that Martin Luther King was a Christian too. And Christians did lead the way in abolishing slavery. So true Christianity did some really good things in the country as well.
Yeah, power rightly applied.
Yeah, no, I think it's really key. One thing that I always want to do, and this is why reading historians has been so helpful in my own professional work, but even as a Christian, right, there are obviously good things that Christians have done and been a part of, right? But I think also Christians have been at the forefront of some really horrible things, right? And so like Christians were totally advocating for segregation, right? And like basing it on Bible and scripture. Like they were drawing from their Christian faith to say like, we have to separate the races. And then we do have Christians that were saying, no, all are created equal and should have equal rights. And so it isn't as though there's just like one, untainted expression, but that, Christianity is always mixed in with our contexts and our cultures. And so now it's up to us to figure out ways to more faithfully live that out. And I think listening to voices that are different than mine and who are Christian has been really helpful for me just to see their perspective and their viewpoint, because I wouldn't necessarily understand it growing up where I did and being in the
they see blind spots we just can't see.
Yeah, totally. So I think that's where it's helpful then to engage, whether it's folks that I might see as more on, politically or religiously progressive or conservative than me. I need to be engaging with that and be thinking through the implications of my beliefs. So yeah, Christians have been involved in great good and been involved in creating great terror, for thousands of years. And that's where I think we just have to take seriously, like, there is no like perfect thing that we need to go back to, but that it's always been difficult and we're trying to find our way. We need to have these conversations. We need to be, challenged, especially by those who, have been marginalized, because they're going to see stuff, right? They're going to see how these systems are harming folks. And then I think it's up to us to align with them and to work towards a common flourishing.
Got it.
So yeah, so and I think Peter's echoed this too, is what you're saying as well, as Christianity exercised and practiced correctly and biblically always should and always does the right thing, but it's some Christians as individuals can and will mess up, but that's not a reflection on true Christianity.
Well, I mean, I think, it's an interesting question, because the idea of like, the Bible has always been used by various groups of Christians to support both good and bad things, right? And they're both like, so the North and South during the Civil War, you have pastors who are explicitly drawing on the Bible to support their views. And so it isn't just as though there's like some Bible verse or true Christianity, out there that we're trying to find, but that our faith can be used, and the Bible and scripture can be used in different ways for good and bad. And so then that's where we have to really wrestle together and try to find, okay, what are those aspects that help push us towards expressions of Christianity that love our neighbor, that lift up the oppressed, that free the prisoner, that heal the sick, right? Those things that I mean, at least at this point in my journey, that I think Jesus was about, and that he was focused on, and that God has been focused on in his story of interacting with humans, since we started recording it. But I think it's difficult to say that like we just have to follow the Bible, because the KKK, they were,
that's what they would have said.
Verses, right? And so that's where, we really need to think through those different aspects. But
okay, cool. So my next question would be: there's something entirely overrealized and human-centered about the kingdom within Christian nationalism, and how it's pursued entirely foreign to the Bible. So this kind of just follows up with what we were talking about. Bad theology would hurt people. So how is the kingdom of God understood within Christian nationalist movement?
Yeah, so I think, as they share, as we've interviewed folks, they would see the kingdom of God, America being a part of that, where one particular political or cultural view and beliefs, of this particular expression of Christianity is central to how our society is organized and functions, right? So they would see that as part of God's kingdom work. But the result of that is it benefits one particular group, and generally that group. Whereas I think the kingdom of God is much broader, right? And would take into account and wouldn't ignore those who are on the margins. Whereas in Christian nationalism, a lot of times it's, we deserve power, we deserve to have a say exactly how this is going to be laid out. And those on the margins maybe, just need to work harder or become Christian or do whatever else. And that's where I think the distinction becomes, where the kingdom of God is about, breaking down those dividing walls and working towards the flourishing of all. And again, that can include politics and systems, necessarily. And that isn't something that's bad, but I think that's where we see some of that distinction.
Yeah, almost like they're trying to usher in through, and this is a different topic, but they're trying to usher in the kingdom of God through their efforts, through their power, and they're like, oh, God is going to kind of bless our efforts, and we're the purest expression of this, and therefore you got to take this, because this is the only way God's coming back into this country, is if we get what we want done.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, for Christians, then it's thinking about, well, what does it mean to be Christian in a pluralistic democratic society, right? And if we're going to have that, which is what America, at least the founding ideals, not that we lived it out perfectly at the beginning, but the ideals were, then that means that we have to listen to folks who are secular and maybe have very different views on a number of things. And we have to compromise and come to agreements on how we can live together. And again, hopefully, and show the flourishing of all people. But when it's just us or our way or the highway, I think that's where the difficulty comes in.
Yeah. So that's a good transition to this next question. We've talked so much about where it's come from, some of the expressions of it, some of the ideology behind it, some of the desire behind it. And because you've devoted so much of your scholarly and kind of personal life to the Christian nationalist movement or Christian nationalism, and you talk about this somewhat at the end, where do you see it going next? And this is not like, where do you kind of hope it dies next, but where do you actually see it going next? What do you honestly think kind of they're aiming for? And maybe not the next iteration, but some of the stuff that, hey, this is something we should watch out for.
Yeah. I think, it's going to be with us into the future, because it's been with us, as we talked about already, through our history. And religious nationalism too is not unique to Christianity, and it's not unique to the United States. There are other countries and other religions where we see these same types of mechanisms taking place, right? Religion is just so powerful that power and politics are going to play a role in that in any nation. So, one recent shift is seeing folks like identify with it positively and saying like, I am a Christian nationalist. And I think, that is difficult and can kind of muddy the waters, because again, as we talked before, like the labels, right, can make it difficult to talk about the ideology and the cultural framework. And so wrestling with that's one thing that I'm is a little discouraging to see. But I do see many conservative Christian Americans who are engaging with it and pushing back against Christian nationalism, right? And where Christian nationalism wants to, limit access to the democratic process, you see folks saying, no, what it means to be American is, you have a right to vote. It isn't just a privilege, but a right. And so that's good to see. And I think we will see more folks really working to encourage, an engagement with the public sphere that is open to all and encourages democracy, those types of things. So I guess that leans into what I hope to see, but we are seeing it. So that's good too.
Yeah. And then real quick, just to follow up with that and cap off the episode, what would be some just practical advice on working towards biblical justice, no matter how you vote, knowing that we don't really want to mix religion and politics too much, but we want to uphold biblical justice, and that's the most important thing. So any practical advice for voters to still vote, but with that.
Yeah, maybe especially like Nick was saying, especially for conservative Christians who are like, I'm not part of this movement. How can I rightfully engage with this movement, but kind of still hold my conservative values?
Yeah, definitely. No, I think, one of the biggest things is to really engage with political and religious and theological viewpoints that might make you a little uncomfortable and might challenge you. And so that's where, I'm grateful for this conversation. But then too, really wrestling with our histories and empirical data. So it isn't as though, like one example, and it's kind of astounding this hasn't come up yet, but I'm gonna drop it in right at the end here. But when we're talking about abortion and the pro-life movement, right? So ending, legalized abortion, that has been kind of the end goal of the pro-life movement, right? Like we want it outlawed. Now, there's all this other stuff wrapped up in this, but empirically, a number of really, really grounded, empirically supported ways of lowering abortion rates are like sex education and really good access to contraceptives and all those things. So I think there could be conservatives that are like, I want to lower, those unwanted pregnancies, which that's why abortions happen. So let's
almost like before they even start, let's figure out how we can get this done.
What are all the different ways that we could go for this end goal, which is like the flourishing of life? So we have to think about the mothers, not just the unborn children, all those things. And so that's where engaging with empirical data and not just being roped into this very narrow, like politicized wedge issue, right, that a political party might give us, but like, how can we engage with this problem? Because these problems are really big and there's a lot of gray area. But what can we do? And let's do all those things. And so I think conservatives can really move again towards the flourishing of all people and listening to those marginalized voices saying, hey, we need this, right? And how can we move toward that? So in the book, towards the end, one of the people I interview, a friend of mine, she says how no friendship is apolitical, right? So when we move to the marginalized and we engage with them and become their friends, we start to see the world from their perspective. And they're going to show us things where it's like, hey, I can't flourish because of, what's happening here. And then it's up to us to engage with that. And I think conservative, progressive, wherever you are, that's work we can all be a part of. And the political process in this country is like, we may have different ways we think, this end goal that we agree on, the best way to get there. So let's talk about how to do that. And when we work together on those things, we'll hopefully find a way forward. And again, keeping in mind those that are marginalized in the flourishing of all, I think helps us search for that common good. And that would be the hope.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Dr. Whitehead, thank you so much. And maybe just to plug some of your work, plug the work that you guys do at your university, some of the institutes that you work for, just kind of where you can direct folks like, hey, if you like this conversation, if you want more of this, this is where you can go.
Yeah. So the data archive that I talked about with a lot of great resources is thearda.com. So thearda.com. And so, hopefully people can find that. And then I'm on social media and you can probably pretty easily find me there. And that's where you can keep up with this book and Taking America Back for God, and other writings and things that I'm doing. And, so just again, thank you to you both so much for reading the book and really engaging with it and sharpening, me and how I'm thinking about this as well. It's just, I really do appreciate it. So thank you.
Of course, yeah. Thank you so much for coming on our show. We'll connect with you again. Sure, I'm soon, sometime in the future.
All right, sounds great.
Thank you.